Over the last 10 years, sea levels have risen at an alarming rate. Biodiversity is reportedly declining faster than that of any time in human history. And millions of people have been affected by extreme weather like hurricanes and floods.
Climate change. You hear it discussed in terms of its relationship with mankind's exponential technological growth. It has been discussed in terms of its relationship with ecosystems, with economies, even its relationships with political ideologies. Less spoken about is climate change's relationship with migration and how it's affecting demographic shifts already in full motion. Communities that depend on the predictability of weather patterns, such as farming communities, are silently relocating on a massive scale. What's happening at the border between Mexico and Guatemala is a great example. Tens of thousands of families, many that have depended on farming for their livelihoods for generations, are being forced to abandon their land as traditional farming methods no longer provide what they need to survive. Farming methods that are sensitive to the smallest of changes. Those unable to adapt to the most severe impacts of extreme climate change often represent cultures that date back thousands of years. As the large-scale displacement of these vulnerable communities accelerates, the importance of cultural preservation will be put to the test. How will the acceleration of climate migration impact the cultural preservation of vulnerable communities? Can technologies, such as the internet, help preserve vulnerable cultures, or will it be an obstacle to those who need the preservation the most? Expressions of identity that unite communities in the form of architecture, music, dance, language, and food tell the story of a people's relationship to the human family. Cultural anthropologists and other scientists and scholars that study this human phenomena have done so under different names for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The observations and cataloging of cultural artifacts can be a long and arduous process, involving tens of thousands of pages, hours, and interactions. As technological innovations have accelerated, so have the various methods of preserving cultural artifacts, expanding access to rich archives of cultural heritage. As climate change accelerates, which tools and methods will best serve cultures closest to the front lines of this advancing threat? How can technology and the internet be used to meet this global challenge?
Today we are here in the IPCH Conservation Lab, and it's a single space where everybody works together. That was the idea behind the whole concept of it. First major collaboration is with the Research Science Department of the Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage, which is literally across the corridor from this lab.
Large institutions and museums are digitizing archives for eyes of global audiences, while online portals such as YouTube and Facebook are becoming treasure troves of film and audio recordings. While technology has given cultural preservation a new global dimension, who is it really designed to benefit? It has often been said that the US, for example, is a melting pot of cultures. However, conflict theorists agree that America is closer to a multicultural society than a melting pot. The problem with the melting pot idea is that cultures do not fuse together homogeneously. Our history, our culture, our information have all been often viewed and represented through an ethnocentric lens, prioritizing one subculture over another. What stops those who control the internet and the access of information from filtering and submerging the cultures that they deem more relevant to global audiences? What stops algorithms from further fueling echo chambers of information and cultural silos? Can the internet truly reconcile its global audience with the needs of vulnerable cultures? Can the internet really help in the process of cultural preservation? Or will cultures be submerged in a sea of information? How will this global lens impact these vulnerable cultures over the long term? If the titanic goal of cultural preservation for those most impacted takes shape, what role would it play in the larger context of culture? For one, it could help migrating communities reconnect with their past customs. Traditions are often linked to geography, which include the environmental characteristics of an area such as the flora and fauna. Environments not only shape perceptions of reality, but also the cultural identities of a group. As groups relocate, their cultural identity will be challenged by the more dominant culture. This could lead to a series of problems, such as difficulties for adaptation, discrimination in their newfound society, and forced assimilation.
Acculturation to me is learning how to keep your culture while interacting successfully with other cultures. Whereas assimilation to me is more of the melting pot where you lose who you are in order to become more like the dominant culture. When we see kids starting to shed who they were, then we see a disconnect happening at home, and that creates more social issues for the family.
An important aspect of conserving cultures is the embedded knowledge of customs and traditions. Think of the stories, the religions, the history, the art, and the endless cascade of human activities that provide a small window into a universe of ideas and possibilities. Western society knows well, almost intuitively, of the importance of this fact, which can be seen in the elevation of importance of Western perspectives over all else. The urgency of cultural preservation should reflect the urgency demonstrated by the monument men in World War II, whose sole task was the transportation and security of artistic artifacts. One clear example of this embedded knowledge can be seen and heard in language.
Madre, iño, padre, iya, machete, hija, jojoa, isandaro, atoa.
Each of these languages holds a little piece of information or a lot of information, can hold information about medicines and health, can hold information about the constellations in the sky, and that's an information that if you lose the language, you lose that connection with that place, with that way of thinking, with tens of thousands of years.
As the world rediscovers ways of living in balance with nature, ancient knowledge and tradition will begin to resurface as valuable sources. We cannot know what pieces we might need for the future, even if we think we know it all. We cannot take for granted the added knowledge of past generations and the various survival mechanisms of these communities. Who is best suited to take on this challenge? Traditionally, the archiving of cultural artifacts can take months or even years of observing and building trust with communities. Will reputations of large institutions, such as UNESCO, Smithsonian, and others, help or hinder relationships with communities most vulnerable to climate change? Do nonprofits and NGOs have the methodologies to begin to meet this titanic task? Will these institutions focus rather than merely consider the perspectives of vulnerable communities? Will they organize their plan of action with the needs of vulnerable communities at the center? In the era of large and well-funded NGOs, the work has already begun. The National Trust for Historic Preservation and UNESCO's World Heritage Center have begun research initiatives to attempt to meet this need. Cultural preservation that focuses on interactions between people may prove the best way forward in the era of accelerating migrations. The internet, digital video, and social networking platforms could capture recordings of theme-based conversations between mothers, daughters, grandfathers, and grandsons, giving a substantial insight into the culture, language, and dynamics of communities vulnerable to sudden changes in their ecosystems. Emphasizing these connections and the artifacts and rituals that are central to culture could give us the most complete representation and preservation that benefits both vulnerable communities and the globe as a whole.